Hey folks, welcome back to the Wikipedia world, and I am Abhinay Gupta. And today again we are continuing with the interpretation of statute, deeds, and documents. Right? So in the previous lectures we have completed almost the entire chapter. Right? And if I tell you, then the entire chapter basically consisted of the interpretation of statute. Right? For that we have seen the basic rules of interpretation, the primary and the secondary rules. We have seen the internal aid and we have also seen the external aid to interpretation. Right? In today's lecture, we will move to the second part of this chapter, which is, the last part of this chapter, which is the interpretation of deeds and documents. We have not yet discussed about this topic so far. We did not even touch the interpretation of deeds and documents anywhere. We were very busy doing the interpretation of statute. And 95% of the chapter deals with the interpretation of statute. So we have just the last 5% left that will be done in the class today. Right? We'll try to wind up the entire concept of the interpretation of deeds and document in the class today. Right? And okay, today in the beginning I'll tell you that you have not been asked a lot of questions on this part of the chapter in your previous examination, right? But surprisingly, 3-4 times the questions have appeared in 2009, 2010. Like if you see, then 2009 November, 2010 May, 2010 November, consecutively 3 attempts you had a question from this topic. Before that, you had it in 1999. After that, you had it none. Right? So in between, all of a sudden, 3 consecutive attempts, question from the same topic. You see how much unpredictable is your institute, right? So I always suggest that you do not leave any topic. You can leave a chapter. I've always told you can leave a chapter, but if you are covering a chapter, cover it 100%. Because if you give a 90% in that chapter and the question drops in from that other 10%, that's a very big regret. Right, but if you have left a chapter and you know the questions will be coming from there, you do not panic in the examination, because you were prepared in the back of the mind that you would be leaving that question. Right? But when you have given in a lot of effort to one chapter and then something that you have left and that is asked in the examination, you panic. And that affects the entire examination. Right? So always take that suggestion. If you want to leave something, leave an entire chapter, instead of leaving bits and pieces of various chapters. Right? Whatever chapter you pick up, do it in totality. And I would always suggest law is not a very lengthy subject, right? And it is also an interesting subject if you try and understand what law means to say. Going to the plain text, it becomes a little cumbersome because understanding the text is a difficult task, right? That is why we are doing this interpretation, so that you are able to interpret the law very beautifully. Right? So today we'll proceed with the interpretation of deeds and documents. Let us start with the lecture. So the rules of interpretation of deeds and documents. Now over here also there's one thing I would let you know, that if you refer to your study material, you just have 4-5 paragraphs given over there in one single page, and the entire topic is over. Right? But I have tried to put it down in bullet points for you so that it is easier for you to understand. Right? And I've also taken in some other points from some other authors as well, apart from the points given in the study material. And before starting, I would also want to tell you the kind of questions you have been asked. So right, out of these 4-5 times that you have been asked direct questions like discuss the rule of interpretation of deeds and documents, explain the rules of the interpretation of deeds and documents, what are the various rules of interpretation of deeds and documents, or explain the rule of reasonable construction for your statute as well as deeds. Because I'll tell you, the law of reasonable construction applies over here as well. These are the basic questions that you have been asked. So writing paragraphs in the examination will also not fetch you the full marks, right? That becomes difficult. Why? Because the examiner will not read those paragraphs. But in the study material, you have been provided with 4 paragraphs, that's it. So we have made an effort to give it to you in bullet points. Right? And these points are very easy to remember, and you can expand them as per your will, and that will be also an easy task after I explain it to you. And when you write your answers in these bullet points, you score marks. Right? And will not deviate in our points from the study material. although we may give something an extra, right? So we'll go through this topic with that base in mind. So let us see what we have. Number one, interpret it from the view of a reasonable man. Okay, so we have already applied the rule of reasonable construction over here. Okay, this is one of the questions also, the rule of reasonable construction, application in statute and deeds as well, right? So let us see what it is. So the first thing here that we need to understand is who is a reasonable man, right? The word reasonable man that has been used in the study material as well. So who is the reasonable man? So a reasonable man is considered to be a person who is well informed about the entire fact, right? Entire fact of the deed. Like what is the surrounding, what are the circumstances, what is the scope, right? What is the intendment, right? And I'm talking from exactly from your study material, right? If you have it, you can refer to it. So if a person has these knowledge, any person, any layman who has the knowledge of the scope and the bent or the direction of the deed, right? What does he interpret from the plain text of the deed is the actual interpretation. So if you refer to the interpretation of statute, right? The first rule that we had over there was the rule of literal interpretation. So what was literal interpretation? What anybody would understand by reading the statute, right? But understand that statute and deeds are two different things. Statutes are general for everybody who wants to read it. But deeds are not for everybody. There are two parties to the deeds, right? A deed is being signed between two people, or two or more people, whatever it is, right? But it is not a public document, basically. I mean, it is not necessarily a public document. That can also be public at times, right? But it is not open for everybody. It's not a common deed for the entire country, right? So we have different things over there. So since statute is a common statute for the entire country, over there literal interpretation would mean a layman who may not have any knowledge about the law, about anything else, but with plain text, what would he construe, right? But whereas when we talk about the deeds, right, we are not talking about the class 10 to a student or the layman outside. We're talking about the two parties to the contract, to the deed. We're talking about the other people who are connected, who would be using the deed. They are all educated people, right? So they can understand the scope, they can understand the surrounding, they can understand the circumstance. So in the same case, they say that over here we talk about the literal interpretation, but we do not have a layman over here. We have a person who has reasonable knowledge, right? A person who can understand the deed, a person who can understand and analyze the situation, the circumstance, and the direction and the scope, right? So whatever will that person interpret from the words of the deed, that would be the actual interpretation, means the literal interpretation, right? And I hope this comparison brings out the definition or brings out the meaning even more clear, right? The next point that we have, do not provide any weightage to any other document. Now when we say you should not be providing weightage to any other document, right? So we mean to say that whenever you are trying to interpret a particular deed, right, and you come across a word and you do not understand what that word intends, and what you do is you go back, you pick up some other deed and see, okay, the same word has been used. What is the context? And you say, okay, we have the same interpretation. But no, that is wrong. This deed that you are dealing with has a different scope. It has a different circumstance. It has a different intention. And the other deed may have something different. So how can you say that, okay, the two common words used in the deeds will have the common meaning? No. English is a language. Every word can be used in several meanings, right? So that is why we say that whenever you are referring to a deed, please do not pay any weightage to any other document having the same word. But yeah, sometimes you can also do it when the language of the two documents are identical, right? That is the only situation when you can do it, right? That is not specified in your study material, but yeah, you can do it in that way. So that you even had a case, if I refer to a case, it was a case of the Union of India versus D.N. Reverie and Company, right? In that case, they said, okay, since the two documents have a common language, we can consider an interpretation of the other document to be the same for the document under consideration. Right? Okay with it? Third point. Words would bear the same meaning throughout the document unless context compels. That means if I'm using any specific word in that deed, right, then that word is used in the direction of the deed, in the circumstance of the deed, in the scope of the deed. So what we say that when we are talking about a deed in totality, right, we have a common scope for the entire deed. We have a common circumstance for the entire deed. Right? Scope, circumstance, surroundings, they change from deed to deed, but for one deed it will always remain common. So any word that has been used with reference to these scope, these surroundings, these circumstance, these intentions, they will remain common throughout the deed. Why? Because these four factors that are used, that have been applied while using that word, remains constant. Right? That is the simple reason behind it. So the words would bear the same meaning throughout the document unless the context compels. That means unless and until there is something specific that has been mentioned, right, which compels you to take up some other interpretation or some other meaning, unless certain situations, certain kind of situations come up, you will always consider that a word that has been used once in the deed will have the same meaning when it is used over and over again. Right? This was, I guess, the third paragraph in your study material. Then we have the golden rule. So the golden rule again over here is framed in the same context of the literal interpretation that we have seen, right? We compared the literal interpretation of statute and the interpretation by a reasonable man in the interpretation of deeds, right? That yeah, both the things, the statute and the deeds, are at two different parallels. They have two different audience. Right? Similarly, when we are talking about the golden rule, so it says that first of all, go through the entire deed in plain text. Right? Try and interpret it. You have been through it, you know it, and with plain understanding, with the plain reading through it, with the dictionary meaning, the literal interpretation, you have some interpretation out of it. That will be a general thing. Right? But again, you'll have to consider that when we are writing about the deed, when people who are dealing about the deeds have knowledge, they know what is the surrounding, they know what are the circumstances, they know the intention. So you will also have to consider the intention of the people who have prepared the deed. Right? And when I talk about the intention of the person who has prepared the deed, then understand that the person under consideration is a knowledgeable person. Right? He is not like any other Tom, Dick and Harry. He is a knowledgeable person. So even you know that, okay, when you have to use any words in law or auditing or your accounting, right, when you are using the word materiality, then you know that you are using it in specific context, which brings out the exact meaning of the term and it suits there exactly. But if a layman, right, if somebody else who does not have a detailed understanding of these words, who are not generally exposed to these words, they will construe it in a general term, right? So they will not be very specific with its usage. They will be a little general with its usage. They will use some general words. They'll use the words in general phrases, right? So a layman and an expert can use the same word in two different contexts. That is the difference of the training that the expert has, right? So whenever you are interpreting any deed, right, you will have to keep that in mind, that the person who has framed the deed is a person who has some knowledge. So you will have to construe, or you will have to try and interpret the deed according to the intention of that person. You have to understand what was the intention behind the deed, right? What is the purpose for which the deed has been prepared? So keeping that intention in mind, you'll have to see the usage of the specific words, right? That is the general rule. But for that, you will have to go through the entire deed once with plain reading. Because again, like over there we had, you'll have to read the statute as a whole. Similarly over here, you'll have to read the deed as a whole, right? To bring out the true meaning. And that is the golden rule, right? So even when you go ahead and writing it in the examination, right, you have been given a paragraph on golden rule in the study material. But if you bifurcate it, right, the same paragraph, then you can see that yeah, you need to ascertain the intention of the parties, right? But that will be after considering all the words in the document. Now, what is the methodology that is used? First, the document is read as a whole. Point number one. Point number two, the consideration, the circumstance in which the particular word has been used are considered. Right? So first, read the entire document, understand the circumstance in which that word has been used, and then understand that there is a difference between a layman and a trained person, and their usage of a particular word can also be different. So you'll have to keep that in mind, keep the intention in mind, and then go ahead with the interpretation. Clear with it? So that is all about the golden rule. Next point, you have to resolve the conflict between two clauses in the document. So this is actually the rule of harmonious construction that you apply. Right? That when there are two different clauses in a document and they conflict with each other, which is similar to two different sections in the statute that conflict with each other. So what you try and do is you find a middle way out, right? A route that would join the two tangents, which were actually not joining, which were traveling into different directions. So you will have to draw a third line between them that would join the two tangents, right? That would bring a common path that would suffice the needs of both the clauses, right? That is the rule of harmonious construction that you apply over there. But if at any point of time, for example, the two tangents are going parallel and you are not able to meet them at any point of time, what you do is you will see which clause has been used earlier, right? This is opposite. We are not going with the later in time. We are saying whichever clause was used earlier, that shall override the later clauses. Right? This is the deed. This is not a statute. This has no amendments coming up, right? Because when you have an amendment, you actually try to rectify what was given behind. But over here, when you're using the second clause, you're not rectifying the first clause, right? Because if you wanted to rectify, cancel the deed, prepare a new one. That's very simple. So your second mention of the same topic will not be a rectification of the previous mention. But when you first time mention it, right, that will be your general mention throughout the deed. You are trying to cover the entire deed, and the second thing becomes specific to the point that you are discussing. So in this case, we are not going with the latter, but we are going with the clause that was actually inserted earlier in the frame of the deed, in the frame of the document, right? So if the harmonious construction works, well and good. If it does not, then whichever clause is inserted earlier, consider it to be the correct clause, right? That will prevail in the case of any conflict. And if I tell you, then basically these are the 5 major topics that are covered in your study material, and then your study material comes to an end. The entire chapter comes to an end over there, right? But there are still few more topics which are actually used in the interpretation of deeds and documents, which I got it from the other sources, like I googled it, I got from the various authors, right? So I will also include those points over here. So next, conduct of the parties not to alter the interpretation. So try and understand, right? Over here we have a deed, we have a written document, right? So when you have written a document, you have already inserted your intention behind it, and you have framed it accordingly. So once you have framed it, and it is very simple for us to interpret what is framed or what is documented, then your conduct beyond that point will be irrelevant for interpretation. Why? Because that is an aid, and we are not applying any aid to interpretation so far as the meaning is clear, right? As we have seen in the interpretation of statute, when do we apply the aid? We apply it when our rules do not give us the true interpretation, right? But since over here, if our rules, if our basic reading, if our basic knowledge gives us the true interpretation of the deeds and documents, we do not need to resort to any aid, right? And when we do not resort to any aid, then the conduct of the parties becomes irrelevant, right? I hope you are clear with these terms, right? Next we have, the whole document does not become void due to one invalid clause, right? So you have an entire document, maybe one clause is not applicable or one clause stands void. Does that mean the entire document goes for a toss? The answer is no. That clause will not be applicable. It's a deal between two people. They have various clauses inserted, right? One has to insert the clause, other has to agree upon it. Now, if I have inserted 10 clauses and you agree to only 8, does not mean that those 8 also stands void, just because the other 2 is. Right? If you have agreed to the 8 stands valid, the other 2 that were inserted stands void. That will not have an impact of reducing the entire document to null and void. Right? Just try and see it in the practical concept, in the practical scenario. You have all been through, right? You have all seen a deed or document in your life that has different clauses that you agree upon, right? So the different clauses that you have, most of them are standard clauses that you always have, and there are some that are specific. So if any specific clause or any standard clause goes for a toss, does not mean the entire document becomes void, right? That will remain valid unless and until the clause that goes void, that goes for a toss in this case, is an integral part of the transaction, right? Which is rendered impossible to serve the contract. Now, for example, even if you put up in a rented space, right, and you have a rent agreement, then even the rent agreement is kind of a deed where you have various clauses, right? And if one of the clause does not suffice, that the landlord does not want to give it to you, or the landlord does not offer it to you, other clause remains constant. If it is not letting it out to you, then the entire document goes void in that case. So whatever deed you prepare will not be active because one clause that yes, I'm letting it out to you is not applicable, right? That was an hypothetical example that does not happen, but what I mean to say is if it is an integral part, then only the entire contract or the entire deed goes void, right? And then let's refer to the last point that we have. Interpretation once given remains effective in future proceedings, in further proceedings. Now suppose two parties, they have entered into a deed, right? They have prepared a document, a contract, right? And then the court has interpreted it in one particular term, and then both of the parties agreed and signed the deed, and the deed became effective. Now in future, right, there was a conflict, there was litigation, and then when they went to the court, one of the parties says, no, I want the deed to be reinterpreted. Why for? The court has already interpreted it, and the court, while interpreting that deed, had used the rules, right? So the interpretation cannot be challenged, first of all. Second, even you had agreed to it at that point of time. When we were interpreting the rules, right, you were comfortable with it, it was binding on both of you. Now all of a sudden you cannot come and say alter it. Why? Because now you feel some problem out of it. So you cannot do that, right? So once you have specified something in the deed and you have agreed to it, that cannot be altered, right? Now again, if I take the example of the rent agreement thing, then for example, if the landlord says that okay, you can punch in a little bit of holes on the wall, right? Like if you want to punch in some nails for hanging something, you can do it. Now what did you do is you bought a new split AC and you punched a big hole in the wall just for the outlet of the pipe. And that was not a part of it, right? You agreed to what those small bits of knocks are. This is not a small bit of knock. So later on when you go to the case and the landlord charges you for that, you cannot say no, that is, please interpret it in a good way, right? It's just a knock on the wall. We have a huge wall and that's the small hole over there. You cannot say that. If it was interpreted on that context initially, it will remain the same now, right? You cannot challenge the interpretation of the deed over and over again, right? So these are basically the rules for interpretation of the deeds and documents. Number one, interpret it from the point of view of a reasonable man. Do not provide any weightage to any other document. Words would bear the same meaning throughout the document unless the context compels otherwise. Then you have the golden rule. You remember the comparison between a layman and the expert, right? Then you have to resolve the conflict between two clauses in the document. You apply harmonious construction. Then conduct of the parties not to alter the interpretation if the words are clear, right? The whole document does not become void due to one invalid clause, one or more invalid clause as well, unless and until they are integral. And the last point, interpretation once given remains effective in future proceedings. Exactly. Right? So there you have 8 rules of interpretation, just one liner. Remember these lines, remember these words, and you can frame it on your own. You will not face a challenge with that. So if you have a 4-mark question, small question, go with the first 5 rules given in your study material. And if you have a lengthy question like 6 marks or something, go with the entire thing that I have mentioned on the screen. Right? So that will be all for the day, and that will be all for the chapter. So if we talk about the content of the chapter, we are done with it. We have done all the rules of interpretation, may it be primary, may it be secondary. We have done all the internal aids to interpretation, we have done all the external aids to interpretation, and we've also done all the rules of interpretation of deeds and documents. And that is all. The chapter has just these 4 contents. Right? Now we'll switch on to some next chapter that is somewhere related to your SEBI, SCRA, IRDA and other things. Basically in the allied part, right? We have done a lot of the Companies Act. We'll do the allied part. We'll cover up 1 or 2 major chapters over there and then go by whatever is pending in the Companies Act. Right? And in the meantime, if any one of you wants me to discuss any of the questions, or if you want me to come up with a discussion on any of the chapter, right? If you want me to discuss past year questions or the practice model questions, please feel free to use the comment box and we will also share a class on the same thing. Right? So unless and until we start the next chapter, please stay tuned, complete this chapter in a good detail, understand it, it is very easy. Try to put it on your bullet points, right? Try to prepare your notes for your reference, short notes for your examination references, right? You cannot refer to the classes close to your examinations. These are lengthy and detailed classes, right? So until the next chapter, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off. Thank you and bye-bye.